There is a topic in health and safety which transformed not just how I practice health and safety, but how I practice medicine, how I practice as a leader, and quality management and environment. It completely transformed how I even manage my personal life. This was the understanding of human behavior. I only got to learn this when I did my diploma six and not my level three. And therefore, I've intentionally included this in your level three because I believe that every OSH professional needs to first and foremost understand the people that you are protecting. If you don't understand why people do what they do, your control measures are going to be theoretical. And it's going to be, as we mentioned when we were discussing, from work as prescribed, work as described, not really work as done. If you get to understand people and how they think and what can cause people to act or behave in an unsafe manner, you can better intervene. The topic may look daunting at face value, but I'm hoping that you're getting to see that when we sit down and we discuss this together, because we are discussing this together, when you take your time and listen to the explanation, read the slides, go and read the book, read further, any topic can become simple enough for you to understand it and then to teach it. Whatever lessons you learn about this human behavior, reflect on your own life, both professionally and personally. Make it real. Imagine scenarios where this applies. Start to see that, wow, this is actually true. Seek out case studies of incidents that have occurred all over the world. Read about what was found to be the causes and use this to cement this lesson. If you're able to understand this, you are going to be an exceptional OSH professional and a leader. Because why do people decide to break rules? Why do people act in a way that can endanger them? Is it just a problem with the way they think? No. There are complex things in play that make somebody do what they do. A crane operator has just had a child, a baby. So let's say it's a male crane operator whose wife or partner has just had a baby, maybe 3 days ago. The labor was difficult and we were in the hospital for days. And this crane operator was running between work and the hospital because the company did not give the crane operator time off because of various reasons. We won't go into that. The night before the day in question, his partner or wife was too tired to really watch the baby. And so he had to stay up, take care of that baby. The baby was fussy, had a bit of a fever or something, crying and waking up every 2 hours. If you've had a baby, you would understand the stress of this. Now, that day in question, he's probably had an hour and a half of sleep in little pieces. That crane operator then pushes a wrong lever or makes the wrong move and crashes the load into a building. Are you going to see that that crane operator is a bad person or a bad worker? Or are you going to have to stop and think, what contributed to this and how do we prevent it from happening again? This is the purpose of this. Because if you don't understand this and change your policies, like, for example, allowing people to have paternity leave so that they can deal with this stress, deal with it well, and come back to the workplace refreshed and ready to work, you will have incidents like this happening again and again. The way people behave is complicated and it's a mix of things like the environment, organizational factors. Putting too much workload on a worker would make them cut corners. Now, when they cut those corners and an incident occurs, is it really fair to blame the worker? Or should you really reflect and ask yourself, did I cause this? And how can I prevent this in the future? So, for example, better management of workload. This is so key. So things that can contribute to incidents include distraction. If you've ever been working focused on a topic, on some work, and then somebody comes to interrupt you to ask you to help them with something, you realize that going back to the work becomes a bit difficult because you've been distracted. It's similar to if you're doing very high risk work. An interruption can make you press a wrong button because your train of thought was interrupted. This can even be something like the temperature being too hot in the cabin of the machine you're operating. When you're hot and you're sweating and you're uncomfortable, you are not focusing, you're distracted. And therefore, you're more likely to cause an incident. Stress and overload, time pressure. Telling a driver to drive a distance that takes 4 hours in 4 hours means that the driver does not have any room to take a break. That means that the driver is going to speed in order to make the time. If the driver comes across an unexpected obstacle in the road that delays them for 30 minutes, they're going to make up that 30 minutes by driving like crazy. We have to think about this. Over familiarity. By nature, the more familiar we are with a hazard, the more comfortable we get with it. The first time in our lives as human beings that we saw fire, the fire burnt us, we were a bit more cautious with fire than we are maybe today. Because we've seen fire over and over again on our stoves, etc. And it no longer triggers us that this is a very serious hazard, but it is. And therefore, routine tasks are a huge hazard or a huge risk because people would tend to stop seeing it as dangerous as it is. Fatigue. Studies have found fatigue to be as bad as being drunk. So driving tired can be as bad as driving drunk. Many, many years ago, when my wife and I were young doctors, she had a 48-hour shift. And we used to do that a lot as young doctors. Now, I don't know how to do a 48-hour shift. I don't think I have the energy for it. And she was dead tired and was driving home from work. She woke up in a gutter, in a ditch. She doesn't know how she got there. She doesn't understand. It's like she blacked out because of pure fatigue. So fatigue is very, very, very dangerous. Risk taking shortcuts because, for example, the workload is too much or the time pressure is too much for you to do the work in the way you're supposed to do it. So you take a shortcut. And therefore, you may have all the procedures in place. If the worker feels pressured to finish, oh, they're going to bypass your procedure and it's just going to be on paper. And poor supervision. People would eventually break rules. Not everybody, not in every circumstance, but you should anticipate that a proportion of your workforce will break the rules because this is who we are as human beings. We break rules. Think about your life. Think about all the rules that apply to you, whether warranted or not warranted. We're not going to have a conversation about society, but think about your life and realize that you do break some rules. It is human nature. And therefore, the way to anticipate this and prevent harm from this is to supervise. I'd like to remind you that supervision doesn't mean standing in front of the worker 24 hours. When the worker gets up, you follow them. When they sit down, you come and sit by them, looking at them. No. But it does mean keeping an eye on them. An example would be CCTV surveillance. And remember that respect privacy and dignity as you do this. Or regularly passing by that workplace, whatever it is, to just check to see whether they're doing things as they should. You would want a combination of pre-planned supervision so that they know that you're going to be coming at these specific times and surprise super visits. When people don't know when you're coming, they are more likely to always obey the rules because you may show up at any time. Especially if you do show up at some times and you not penalize, because we're going to describe why it's not always a penalized issue, but you're going to provide feedback, whether positive or negative feedback based on how they're behaving. When they realize this, they're more likely to obey the rules. Understand the people you protect. A fantastic framework for understanding why people do what they do in terms of health and safety is HSG 48. It's by the Health and Safety Executive of the UK, and it's freely downloadable. You can get it for free as a PDF online, or you can buy a copy from the Health and Safety Executive if you are the sort of person who prefers a hard copy, or you can print the PDF. It depends on you. It's called Reducing Error and Influencing Behavior. Our typical thinking is that once there's a human failure that leads to an incident or some deviation from your health and safety procedures, that the person intentionally did it, what we call a violation. HSG 48 recognizes that it's not always a violation, but also sometimes an error. And we're going to go into this bit by bit. The first time I saw this when I was doing my level 6, it looked daunting, but exciting. And by taking my time to go through this, it really, really transformed the way I think. So hang in there with me. At the end of this, you're going to understand this. You don't need to memorize it. You can revise it from time to time just to keep it in mind. But once you understand the fundamentals of it, it changes the way you manage health and safety. So let's break it down. Human failure in terms of health and safety. So somebody doing the wrong thing that resulted in some deviation from health and safety measures or procedures or the way of doing things can be divided into errors, which are unintentional, and violations, which are deliberate. So the first question is, was this deliberate? Was this a deliberate breaking of the rules? Or was it unintentional? The person meant to do the right thing, but made an error. I'll go first into the deliberate ones because that's where our brains naturally go to first. Now, even within these violations, which are deliberate, they're divided into routine, situational, and exceptional. A routine violation is when in the organization, breaking the rule has become commonplace and accepted. It has become commonplace and accepted for workers to stand on a table to change a bulb. It has become commonplace for workers not to wear their personal protective equipment whilst on a construction site. It speaks to the culture of the organization because it only becomes common if it is tolerated. If it is not tolerated, if there's zero tolerance, for example, I went to the head office of a mining company and started to deviate from the pedestrian pathway. A security man promptly called me to order and made me walk along the path that is designated for pedestrians. Another example is I went to a construction site, this large project that was being done. And I started to drive a little too fast. I was quickly prompted, slow down, stick to a speed limit. This makes it very difficult for such violations to become routine. And therefore, if you have a routine violation in your workplace, it means you tolerate it. The other violation is situational. Typically speaking, you wouldn't drive more than your speed limit. But that day, your boss said, hurry up and bring me this document. In that situation, because of resource constraints, where that resource is time, and you don't have the time to stick to the rules, you may break it. The next day, you may not break it, and for the next year, you may not break it until another such circumstance occurs. So it's not routine, but because of that situation. Exceptional is similar to situational, so that's an exceptional violation, whereby you break the rule in a very extreme situation. You wouldn't normally jump out of a window from the second floor, but you do that if there's a terrorist attack or if there's a fire. And so in those extreme situations, you break a rule you know you shouldn't break. It's called an exceptional violation. Why is this important? Because you now know that if you want to prevent routine violations, do not tolerate some behavior. You now know that if you want to prevent situational violations, give enough time, enough resources for people to do what they need to do in the way they need to do it. And you need to plan for rare emergencies. You need to plan for people to have a safe way of dealing with exceptional cases, extreme cases, so that they have a place to escape to in the event of a fire and that they're not trapped in a room and have to jump out of the window, for example. So that is violations. And you now come to see that people are not as bad as you thought. People are not out to make your work as a health and safety professional harder. But these things are expected based on the circumstances that people find themselves in. And therefore, you as an OSH professional can design controls to circumvent these and to minimize these things happening. But apart from violations, we also have errors, which are unintentional. I was driving and I saw a pedestrian in my way and I panicked and I was trying to press the brake and I pressed the accelerator. I did not mean to hit that pedestrian. It was not my intention. I didn't wake up that morning saying that I'm going on a pedestrian hitting spree. It was unintentional. But even within these unintentional errors, is divided into skill-based errors and mistakes. Do not panic. It's not that bad. A skill-based error is an action that was taken not as planned. Meaning you did something thinking you didn't do what you wanted to do. Let me put it that way. It's called skill-based because it usually happens in people who have a skill. An example would be a pilot of an airplane. That pilot is extremely skilled and so used to doing the work. However, if the pilot has his or her attention, or they're distracted by something. So let's say you're flying the plane and you have what we call a bird strike, where a bird randomly flying around rams into your windscreen. That distraction may make you press a wrong button and cause an issue. So because the task is so familiar to you that on a normal basis, you will know the procedure to do. But because your attention was distracted in carrying out that thing that you have a skill in, but you make a skill-based error. This is different from the memory-based lapse. I'm going to zoom out again for you, so please stick with me. A memory-based lapse means you forgot to take a step. You were going out and you forgot to take your wallet. It was unintentional. You didn't plan to find yourself at the store and have no money or not have your credit card. You didn't plan it. But it's something you've done going out over and over again for years. But that day, your memory failed you. And it is common because our memories are not perfect. They are not. And therefore, you may forget to carry out an important step in a procedure. You may forget to tighten a knot or a bolt when you are doing some maintenance of some equipment, and that part will become loose and cause the equipment to explode. You didn't mean to do it, but you missed a step. Why this is important is that, for example, you want to make sure that people's attention is not taken away from the task they're doing as much as is reasonably possible. Or you need to ensure that, for example, you use a checklist so that people know the steps to take just to account for this. So before a pilot takes off, there is a checklist that is followed. The pilot has a co-pilot to minimize these kind of errors because it is recognized that this can happen. And if you do not account for it, who are you going to blame when the plane crashes? Now, under these unintentional things that go wrong or unintentional human behavior are also mistakes. So we have our skill-based errors and mistakes. A mistake is you did what you thought was best in the situation, knowingly, like you knew what you were doing, just that what you were doing was not the best for that situation. It's divided into rule-based mistakes and knowledge-based mistakes. A rule-based mistakes means that, and normally a rule applies. So, for example, you purchase a new microwave, for example, and you're heating your favorite food. The rule for your old microwave was that heat it for 2 minutes and it's perfect. It's not too hot, it's not cold. It's that perfect temperature that makes your mouth water, that makes you happy. This new microwave, unfortunately for you, is more powerful than the old one. And so at the end of that 2 minutes, your food is overheated. The problem didn't arise because you did something wrong intentionally. You applied a rule that was just not appropriate to this circumstance. So the way you would fight a wood fire, a fire from wood, is different from the way you'd fight a fire from electricity. If you've been trained in how to fight fire with wood, and part of it may be pouring water on it to cool it down to stop the fire. When there's an electrical fire, you may apply that wrong rule to the electrical fire and have an electrocution, for example. A knowledge-based mistake, I like to call it a lack of knowledge-based mistake, lack of knowledge. It's when you think you know, but you don't know. You feel like because you've been practicing health and safety for a long time, you can apply, for example, the knowledge that you have from a construction site to a hospital. That can lead you to a lot of errors. You will apply a rule. You see, it becomes very confusing and overlapping, but stick with me. Something has happened, and you think you have knowledge about it, and you act on that knowledge. It wasn't out of malice. It wasn't out of, I want something to go wrong. Just that the lack of knowledge made you make an error. To the example with the health and safety professional who has migrated from construction work to hospital work. On a construction site, for example, you may wait to do your housekeeping at the end of the day, for example, where you're going to clean up after the workers, you're going to pick up debris just to make sure that the site is clear before you close. And then it's clear when you're starting work the next day. In a hospital corridor where workers, patients, relatives, visitors are walking to and fro, housekeeping has to be regular. I mean, like at least every hour, you need to clean up spills, vomits, because these are generated more, well, not more than a construction site. That may not be fair. But just because of the different nature of the work environment you find yourself in. An additional reason why you need to do regular housekeeping in a hospital setting is infection control. Because every vomit that lands on the floor potentially contains infectious substances. If a child is very sick and urinates on themselves and it's on the floor, potentially infectious. Applying your knowledge from a construction site to the hospital, you are going to make a mistake because you lack the knowledge for that specific industry. So it's very important that whichever industry any worker finds themselves in, especially you as an OSH professional, you understand that industry very well. It will avoid you making knowledge-based mistakes, or as I like to call them, lack of knowledge mistakes. So a human being does something wrong in terms of health and safety, makes a misstep, does something that they weren't supposed to do, behaved in an unsafe manner. It may be because it's intentional, or it may be because it was unintentional. When intentional, it may be because you're tolerating it and it has become routine, or because the situation called for them to break the rule, or it may be exceptional in an extreme circumstance. But that thing they did might also be unintentional, where, for example, their attention they lost your attention, or attention, they got distracted for a moment. And under the skill-based error, that loss of attention is called a slip. Or they may have forgotten to carry out a critical step because of they're distracted, they're fatigued, there's time pressure, and that is called a lapse. Now, for the skill-based errors, the action, what happened was not what they planned to do. Unlike a mistake, where they were planning to do it, not out of malice, not out of wanting to cause an incident, but because it was the best they thought they could do. It may be by applying a rule inappropriately, or from a lack of knowledge about that situation, that makes you take a step that you think is best, but actually is not. This is HSG 48, and this explains why people do things like carry out unsafe acts, or leave unsafe conditions as they are, or even create unsafe conditions. So this is another view of it, and I would encourage you to take your time and go through this as well. You can pause the video, look at it, read it, take notes, read further. Okay, understanding this is so key, because you realize that when it comes to the root causes of why human beings do what they do, for example, it can be caused by poor organizational change. Sometimes, let's say your organization is being bought by another company or another organization. This often comes with trying to cut costs, and cutting costs often means that some people are going to be laid off. The ones who remain will have the workload distributed amongst them. That can be dangerous, because then you may put too much load on the person and result in routine violations, situational violations, for example. You may have inappropriate staff levels and workload. A worker is so fatigued that they make mistakes, or they make a slip because they just are so overwhelmed and they get distracted. Fatigue can cause a lot of these human errors. And it can actually cause a violation because, for example, you've given the worker too much work to do before they close. They promised their partner that they're going to have dinner with them. They are going to rush and do the work and break the rule intentionally, for example, in a situational violation, in order to get home to have that dinner with their partner. Poor procedures. And we mean it may not be necessarily be a documented procedure. It may even be a procedure that is well known but not necessarily documented. But if that procedure does not account for the fact that people will forget stuff, by example, having a checklist. So let's say you're doing any task. It is wise to have a checklist just to make sure that you're following every step and following the steps in order. Otherwise, you may miss a step, and that will cause a problem in your workplace. A lack of human factor consideration in risk assessment and investigations. If you do not consider that even though you're introducing these controls, people have the natural tendency to break the rules, you won't factor in something like supervision. You won't factor in something like doing training every 3 months, for example, just to remind people why it's important. Poor communication. If workers are not told how to do the task safely, they will apply the knowledge they have and inappropriately apply that knowledge and, for example, have a knowledge-based mistake. And lack of human factor considerations in design. Machinery can be designed, for example, to account for the fact that one worker, one day is going to try and stick their hand into the machine. And therefore, to prevent that, you may put, for example, a fixed guard over the machine. Microwaves were designed with the knowledge that one day somebody is going to try and open that microwave whilst it's operating, because it will happen. It's a human thing. It can be just out of pure curiosity, and pure curiosity can kill you. So because of that, when you open the microwave door, the microwave switches off no matter which stage of the heating is being done. You take away the ability of the human being to make that error or to commit that violation. And when your organizational culture, in terms of health and safety culture, is not the best. You get, for example, routine violations. The routine violations are just how things are done. When a new employee joins, they are taught the routine violation. This is how we do things here. And if you're not careful and you don't fix that culture, it's going to perpetuate. It's going to keep on going on and on and on. So, how do we deal with this? For slips and lapses, things like your attention, you get distracted and therefore you lose attention, what we call a slip, or you miss a step because your memory failed you because you're a human being and it happens. These usually occur during routine tasks. So you want to minimize the distractions as much as possible. And this depends on how high risk the work is. You want to provide memory aids. An example, for example, if I would need to take something to work. So there was one time I had a very important presentation and I didn't trust my organization's projector. So I wanted to take my own personal projector just so that I'm sure that this presentation will go well. I took that projector and put it in front of my front door, like not outside, but inside, so that I would definitely see it and pick it up before leaving to the car. Even better, I could have even put in the car into the passenger seat. If you don't do this, there is a risk that you will forget to take it and you get to work and you'll be like, oh no, I forgot it. So memory aids are key. Also checklists. Checklists will help you to ensure that the thing is done in the correct order and every step is taken. But it once again depends on a human being actually really filling that checklist. I've seen companies where drivers have checklists they're supposed to fill before they move. And they just sit in the car listening to music and just ticking it off. They're not checking anything. And therefore, you have to be careful that some of these checklists don't become tokenism, something you do just for the sake of doing it. And procedures should be clear and accessible. People need to understand how to do the thing the right way and be able to have it ready to refer to because you will forget a step. It does happen. Even when you do something every day, like driving, you may put your car into reverse and forget that you haven't put the handbrake off. And you start to move and it doesn't move, and you're like, oh, I forgot to put the handbrake off, to put the handbrake off. Imagine this and imagine that this can happen in a high risk environment, which can lead to a serious incident. Mistakes are doing the wrong thing, believing that is right. It was a mistake. The rule-based mistake, for example, is you apply the wrong rule as you described. And a knowledge-based mistake is a lack of knowledge-based mistake. So how do we solve this, or how do we minimize the consequences of this? Improve your training. Train people so that they know which rule to apply. Let them understand that under this circumstance, apply this rule. But under this circumstance, apply this different rule. Improve the competence of your workers. They need to understand, they need to know what to do and how to do it. A worker may be operating a crane from in one organization and come to your organization, and your model may be a bit different from their model. You need to ensure that they're competent, not just because they have that documentation that they've done it before, but you need to train them, watch them actually operate the crane in a safe environment before you then push them out to do this independently. And by independently, it's not really independently because you should always supervise. So maybe semi-independently. You need clear decision-making tools like algorithms. This is seen, for example, in healthcare. If somebody goes into cardiac arrest, there is an algorithm that I can use to decide what to do next and next and next. You can easily remember some of the first few steps, but sometimes you forget. Am I supposed to shock them here? Am I supposed to give them adrenaline? Or like you can't forget. And therefore, if you have an algorithm pasted on the wall, you can quickly divert your eyes, see it, remember, and save a life. It's not because that person is a bad doctor or bad nurse. No, it's because as a human being, you will make mistakes. You, as an OSH professional, need to take each and every necessary step to prevent those mistakes. Violations we mentioned are deliberate deviations. And we mentioned that routine are common, and the key word here is tolerated. It's because it's tolerated in your organization. It's similar to your personal life. If you are treated with disrespect, it's because you tolerate disrespect. I want that to sink in. We are treated the way we tolerate. When we early on establish boundaries, and whenever you enter into a new situation or a new workplace, you want to establish your boundaries, not aggressively, but strategically. So, for example, if you are incapable of staying to 8 p.m., even though you're supposed to close at 5, if you start out closing at 8 p.m., you would always be expected to close at 8 p.m. And because you tolerated it, once you stop closing at 8 p.m., you'll be seen as a bad person. It's crazy, right? Such is the human existence. Situational violations, we mentioned, due to that situation, due to some trigger like time restraints in that situation, that makes you intentionally break the rule. And exceptional are rare and extreme circumstances. So you need to ask yourself, is my culture promoting routine violations? Or are my procedures unrealistic and so cumbersome that people would intentionally break it because it just doesn't make sense? And so it's an intentional diversion of a rule that doesn't make sense or is too difficult for the worker. And therefore, training comes in here, explanation of the why. But sometimes you really do need to consult that worker or the workers and edit your procedure, edit how you do things, because the way you're doing things is causing the problem. And remember, supervision, so that people are not free to break the rules. For the exceptional violations, having emergency response plans that account for as many scenarios as reasonably practicable can help you to avoid people doing the wrong thing in an emergency. But HSG 48 doesn't stop here. It talks about 4 levels of behavioral influence. What are the 4 levels that impact how people behave the way they do? Think of them as the factors that influence behavior. The individual factors are things like your past knowledge, your skills, your experiences. You were driving at a company that didn't require you to wear your seatbelt. When you go to a new company, you're more likely to not wear your seatbelt because of that experience, because of the knowledge you're carrying on from your previous organization, and vice versa. At your old company, you are always wearing your seatbelt. At your new company, you are likely to wear it, even if others are not, until the culture pollutes you, of course. It can also be the person's attitude. Different people have different attitudes to work, to following rules, to sometimes what we call common sense. So you need to understand that people's personal characteristics can affect how they act. Why? And this is why two workers working in the same place, same job description, same salary, one will break the rule and the other will not. You need to understand this. Motivation is what pushes us to do what we do. You have an exam coming up. You will set an alarm and wake up at the crack of dawn to study because you're motivated to do that. If you have no exam, you are going to sleep like a baby because nothing is motivating you to wake up and rob yourself of that sleep. It can also, another individual factor is risk perception. We all perceive risks differently, and a lot of it comes to our knowledge and our experience. Before before the COVID-19 pandemic, when somebody coughs in public or sneezes in public, we didn't really take it that seriously. We may have, been a little uncomfortable, but we don't take it that seriously. During the COVID-19, the risk perception of a cough or a sneeze went up. And therefore, if somebody is even clearing their throats, people start to, yes, ever so subtly or maybe not so subtly, move away from you. Risk perception affects how people behave. And therefore, you'd want to build risk perception. You'd want to make people understand that hazards are dangerous. Example. Now, I want to deviate a bit and talk about risk perception. Perceiving anything, and beyond health and safety, anything involves two broad things, but it's more complicated than this. But let me simplify it. It involves you sensing and interpreting. The sensing is by our five senses: your sight, your hearing, your smell, and then interpretation. If you do not know what LPG gas smells like, you will sense it. Your nose will pick it up. Send those impulses to the brain, but your brain can't make sense of it, and you will light a match, and boom. However, if you know what LPG smells like, there's no way you're going to light that match because your brain has interpreted what you've sensed as dangerous. So things that affect perception are things that affect your sensing or your interpretation, or both. If that day the LPG is leaking, you have a cold, and your nose is blocked, you will not sense it, and therefore you will not perceive that risk. If that day you are smelling the LPG, but you are hungover from having a night of partying, you may sense it, but it won't click that you should do something about it, and you will light that match. So when we are thinking about risk perception, think broadly in terms of the sensing and then the interpretation by your brain. The interpretation by the brain is also affected by things like training. After you go through this certificate course, you're going to start seeing more and more hazards. You're going to start seeing that some things that you thought were not a problem, for example, allowing rules to be broken routinely, you're going to start seeing them as a risk more than you used before. It's not like you are actually seeing them differently. Same eyes, same light hitting whatever you're seeing and going back to your eye and going to your brain. But how your brain now interprets what you're seeing completely changes. Think also about physical and mental health status. We spoke about fatigue. Fatigue can make you snap at somebody who you meant not to snap at, because fatigue can affect your behavior, for example, or being sick. The job factors are very key because they are stuff that is within your control as an OSH professional. Tasks should be not complex, or should be as not complex as reasonably practicable. I mean, you can't say you're going to make the operation of a chemical plant not complex. But when you are designing, for example, a standard operating procedure, you can write it in plain English, easy to understand, so that it's not too complicated that people would, for example, misinterpret what they're supposed to do, or just toss it aside because they give up and do what they need to do, or do what they want to do, sorry. You need procedures and instructions for each and every task, especially those that are safety critical, and they need to be clear, as we've spoken about. Something as simple as translating that your 100-page SOP into a 1-page or a 2-page checklist can make a world of difference. See, I'm not going to read that 100 or 200-page SOP. I'll tell you for free. They won't read it. But if there's that checklist that has summarized all they're supposed to do into easy to understand steps that they tick off and submit that they've done, you would actually achieve more than that thick, cumbersome document. I'm not saying that SOP is not important, but is it translating into a more safe workplace? Reflect on that. And the way a task is designed needs to minimize making mistakes, for example. If by international standards, green means go, red means stop, and you go somewhere and they reversed it to for red means go and green means stop, eventually a problem is going to arise. So you design your tasks so that you take into consideration what would minimize a human being not acting the way they're supposed to act in terms of health and safety. Think about organizational factors as well. So, is there visible leadership where leadership is following the procedures and therefore it cannot become a routine violation? What is the health and safety culture? Health and safety culture is about how most people, if not all people in your organization, think and feel about health and safety, which then translates into how they behave. Are you providing enough training and resources? Do people know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, and the consequences of not doing it? And do you have adequate resources so that you're not rushing people, so that you're not making people cut corners just to meet their quotas? And environmental factors. For example, I'm very uncomfortable when I'm hot. Heat is one of the things I do not enjoy. And therefore, if I'm working, let's say I'm trying to develop a procedure, for example, and I'm hot, I am going to rush that work just so that I can get to somewhere cool. This is true of things like a noisy work environment or doing work in a poor posture. When I was actively practicing clinical medicine and training junior doctors, I used to tell them that whenever you're going to set an IV line or an IV cannula on a patient, grab a chair and sit down. Because as you're bending over and you're uncomfortable, you're rushing and you will make mistakes. But when you sit down, relax, take your time and do it, it'll actually take you a shorter time because you are not distracted by that workplace condition that is making you rush to finish. So sit back and reflect on what you've done or ways in which you behave that you shouldn't have behaved, or an incident that occurred that involved human behavior, or incidents in the world that have involved human behavior. Try and think about it. What were the individual factors that contributed to this? The job factors, organizational factors, and environmental factors. Do not limit your thinking to individual factors as we are inclined to do automatically. And this is why we say health and safety is not common sense. Because if you follow so-called common sense, you run into trouble. Health and safety needs education. You need to knowledge like what you're getting now. And this transforms your mind because it expands your filter. So we need to understand that these four levels are not standalone. They interact and reinforce each other. If a person has a poor attitude already to health and safety from their previous organization, and they come and you are not, and the organizational factor has not enough supervision, you are reinforcing that poor attitude, for example. And therefore, if you want to effectively manage human behavior, you need to tackle all four levels of that behavioral influence, or these four factors. You need to tackle them. And leaving just one will cause you a bit of trouble. So, first, map out the factors under the four levels, and then figure out control measures that can take care of all of them. Things like simplification. As we mentioned, the less complex something is, the more likely it's going to go well. When the pilots, and I've heard because I don't fly, I'm not a pilot. With my vision is not the best, I wouldn't pass. When a pilot is going to take off, the controls and then the displays that they are seeing and they're using moves in a logical manner from takeoff to landing. This is more simple or less complex than having in one corner is the takeoff, one aspect of takeoff, in another corner is another aspect of takeoff, in the middle, another aspect of takeoff. A mistake will eventually occur, or an error will eventually occur. Okay, so try and simplify your procedures to make it as simple as possible. The wave of health and safety is to simplify. The old way of doing things was to explain complex procedures and make people memorize steps. We are now shifting towards making people understand the why, understand the basics of it. Simplification, because that is what brings clarity and therefore minimizes errors. You need to create consistent procedures, simplify those into checklists, just so that people follow the steps the way they're supposed to do. Because you do realize that people will make mistakes or errors, not from their fault, but because of the things you described before. Fail safes. You need to anticipate that when you're working with Microsoft Excel, you mistakenly enter a wrong formula. The system could leave you alone and make you make your mistakes or errors. But typically, it will alert you that, are you sure? Or are you sure this is not an inappropriate step, for example? These are fail safes. They have been designed in anticipation of these things. And therefore, systems that when you're going to take a very critical step, for example, you're the president of the United States and you're going to launch a nuclear weapon, there are steps in place to ensure that, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you very sure before you can finally do this? Clear signage, visual information, also simplistic. For example, an image showing step by step how to correctly lift a heavy object in the area that they lift the heavy object. So that as they're about to lift that heavy object, they're going to see that image and remember that these are the steps I'm supposed to take. Otherwise, they may end up leaving out a step like bending at the knee and keeping your back straight, which would cause harm to them. So remember, training has a key role to play. Clarity of your procedures, which comes by simplification. Supervision, because people will break rules whether you like it or not. There's nothing you can do about it. And therefore, you need to ensure that you are there to say, don't do it this way because of A, B, and C. Please do it this way. And positive reinforcement. We're going to talk next in a few slides about behavioral-based safety, BBS. And we'll talk more about positive reinforcement when we get there. Ensure that there's visible leadership, that you're demonstrating your commitment to doing the right thing. Now, when you do this, people are more likely to follow your leadership and do the right thing. Open communication. Workers need to be able to tell you that this procedure you put in place is rubbish. Not in those words. But they need to tell you that, for example, it's too complicated, and therefore this is why we do A, B, C, and D, so that you can simplify it. But if they can't come and communicate to you about it, they will just bypass it to get their work done. You need a just and fair culture where you are going to be thinking about not that the incident occurred, but was the person's behavior that led to the incident acceptable or unacceptable? And for example, was this contributed to by lack of organizational factors like good supervision, training, ensuring their competence to do the role? And remember that anytime an incident occurs, as you are investigating, look also into the human factors so that you can learn, so that you can put in the control measures from the lessons learned to minimize the chance that that worker will make that error, mistake, violation, etc. again. So the lessons learned from HSG 48 are: when human beings behave in a way they're not supposed to behave, including health and safety, it's deeper than just they wanted to break the rule. A lot of times, they didn't actually intend to break the rule. And a lot of times, the organization indirectly or directly contributed to that. Reflect on this. It will completely change how you view life and health and safety.